Okay, so uh, thank you very much, Harry, Dylan, and the university for inviting me to give this talk. And I'm sorry it was so delayed. But here we are, and wish you all again a very happy new year belated. So I'll get straight down to my talk. And as you said, the talk's title is Beyond Dispersals, Exploring Multiple Dimensions. And although only I'm going to be the speaker, obviously my colleague, Dr. Kumar Akhilesh, who I think has joined this lecture, he's there somewhere, and many other colleagues are involved in what I'm going to say. So I'll come back to them at the end. But why dispersals? So the reason why I chose this particular topic is because South Asia has been a key, in a key geographic position, which leads us to think a lot about migration and dispersals and questions of the site. But in the quest for origins and arrows across the world, in which India plays a very key role nowadays, one often tends to overlook the very little micro details of sites and regions and very local behavioral variability, which very often gets masked. So I'm going to move beyond a review and the big picture to zoom down to these little micro details at sites and move between spatial and temporal scales in the region which we are currently working in. So I'm going to talk about debates in South Asian prehistory, a little bit situating the context of our own work in a wider historical sense. And we also will focus on primarily the Acheulian at the sites we are working in, a little on the middle, and work on what we are doing next. So we will talk about issues relating not only to nomenclatures and migrations, of course, but issues such as technological convergence, debates in cultural evolutionary trajectories, and situate our work in this bigger picture. So for this, we will move between both short and long-term occupational records at prehistoric sites and shifting patterns in spatial organization of populations across landscapes that reflect varied behavioral strategies through time. So this is the crux of what I'm going to speak about. And lastly, we'll touch a little bit upon public outreach because this is something we feel very strongly about. And I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. So let's begin. In the first part, let's situate our work within the bigger context of debates in the South Asian Acheulian primarily and other aspects of its prehistory. So I have overshot as usual, but in the first place, the first thing we need to understand is that the South Asian Paleolithic has had a remarkably long record and a very rich body of information which has been built up by numerous scholars through time, information on site contexts, on palaeoenvironments, and on so many other aspects of prehistory, right from the 19th century onwards, when the first Paleolithic artifact was discovered in the very region where we work in 1863 by Robert Brucefoot. And through this time period, there have been many different conceptual approaches in the way in which this record has been thought about. And obviously, these affected and influenced interpretations of the record. So whether it's in terms of nomenclatures or whether it's aspects related to approaches borrowed from the new archaeology or post-processual or whatever the case may be, this record has this remarkable trajectory of research. But when we look at issues in Indian prehistory, and I put it as the known and the unknown, and look at it in terms of its positive side and the negative side. So on the positive side, we have this wonderful density and diversity of sites and lithic assemblages with spatio-temporal variability and great records. But on the negative side, there is a relative paucity of well-excavated and dated sites, and of course, the scarcity of fossil hominins, which are really make things very glamorous, but we have very few fossils of this time period. And also not enough studies done on paleoenvironmental proxies at archaeological sites. In addition, through time, there has been a sort of a tendency to publish in local journals and books. So even though that is largely in English, this has often led to studies by South Asian prehistorians being left sort of uncited in global discourses on prehistory. So these are some of the aspects which we need to consider. So overall, in this region, we have this, as I said, remarkable record. Definitely from the Acheulian onwards, with some debates on Mode 1 or Old 1 or pre-Acheulian assemblages, with a great potential on exploring issues in cultural transitions, changes, and implications in terms of behavior. And this record is not only long, it is also marked by great spatial variability. So you have different things occurring in different parts of this region through time, and with implications on looking at local evolutionary trajectories, local influences, say from Southeast Asia, from the West, or whether something is happening indigenously. So this makes it very, very interesting when we are looking at this sort of diversity across the region. We have a rich record of sites in different sedimentary and ecological contexts, whether it's rock shelters or in these playas, or if you consider Nepal in the Shivaliks, or in regolithic contexts, in colluvial contexts, in a diversity of sedimentary, stratified open-air contexts, with implications for understanding not only the way in which we perceive these, interpret behavior, but also related to a whole lot of geomorphological and other factors which influence the visibility of sites, influence their distribution, and influence what is the context from which they are either eroding out of, or what is the context we are finding them in for paleoenvironmental and other studies. In terms of paleoecology, despite the occurrence of fossil remains, for example, faunal remains, one of the sad things about Indian prehistory is that as far as when you go further back in time, the occurrence of fossil fauna in direct association with stone tools occurs only at few sites and regions, thereby rendering debates on hominin niches being a matter of sort of piecing together inferences for the same. So you have a sort of lack of bridging arguments, or a sort of a disconnect between the proxies and people. And this is something with which a lot of archaeologists are actively working on nowadays, to get more information from a diversity of paleoenvironmental proxies, to be able to build some models on hominin behavior in response to paleoenvironmental changes. And the same is true for fossil cranium, the hominin fragmentary remains, this cranium and a few other postcranial remains that play a actually very small role in this story. Therefore, the key to piecing together all this data lies primarily in the lithic assemblages. Similarly, despite this richness and wealth of sites, we have very few sites which have actually been dated from well excavated contexts. So you can see, although these little red triangles represent many sites, a number of them have been dated in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and very few have been dated recently. And in these cases, you see that compared to the numbers of sites which we have across India, we have very sparse dates, and this is a major issue. Very few of these little triangles, and this is another one of the key reasons why debates on various questions in South Asian prehistory have really been neglected when looking at it in a global context. So this is another major factor for the same, and which requires a lot more sites which can be dated more accurately and more efficiently. Despite the paucity of dates, what we have and our strength is this wonderful rich lithic assemblage and lithic record. So whether it is issues related to evolutionary trajectories and cultural change, whether it's issues related to technology, assemblage variability, and deconstructing stone tools with more sophisticated ways, or whether it is aspects related to cognition and behavior. These are some areas which are hugely potential in South Asian prehistoric studies, and which are being increasingly studied by a number of prehistorians across the country. Let's come then to the question of dispersals. Now, the question of Acheulian origins, for one, has been debated globally. And as far as South Asia is concerned, we know very well that there is a very excellent and clear record of the Acheulian. But was there anything there prior to the Acheulian, as you see elsewhere in Africa and parts of Eurasia? Was there an old one? Was there a mod one? Now, there are a few studies on this, and you can see here I put a question mark in here, which are still being debated. And although personally I don't see any reason why not, at present there is really no consensus on the presence of any cultural phase which predates the Acheulian in India. Despite this, when you look back in time, there have been a number of claims made for the occurrence of a mode 1 in this region. So whether you have something called the Soanian, whether you have the Rivat complex or the Masol complex or many other sites, these have been suggested at different points in time. And you can see I put in red a lot, which a number of sites which have been clearly disproved over the years, but still there are questions and there are debates regarding the Rivat complex and regarding this Masol complex sites, which are very interesting, and we should wait to see where that takes us. So the fluctuating fortunes of a mode 1 in India, you can see that through time, it was proposed and defended in various ways for a very long period of time. Then some doubts started occurring more recently, in which many of these very supposedly old industries were found to be post-Acheulian. And then finally, this concept sort of disappeared. But recently, with new research in Northwest India, it seems to have been resurrected again. So what next, I really don't know, but this question is one of great importance. As regards the Acheulian, we certainly don't have any type of uncertainty. The earliest appearance is certainly at the sites we are working at 1.5 million years or even older, and we'll discuss that later in this talk, and this remains undisputed. When you come to the question of later dispersals, say the big debates on modern human dispersals into South Asia, we see several different theories, whether they occurred post or around 60,000 years ago with the microlithic technology, whether they were associated with the Middle Palaeolithic around 125 kilo years, or whether there is another scenario where there are earlier and later dispersals with a greater degree of complexity. So at present, again, as I said, this question is very difficult to resolve because of the paucity of dated sites and excavated contexts, but I'll touch on it later when we talk about our own work at some of the sites in southern India. So against this background, I'll just put forward now the outlines of our long-standing research project. So this project has been going on for around 20 years now, and we are working in southern India. And we are going to zoom down in this talk from these pan-Indian perspectives to the regional Paleolithic landscape, to the sites and the lithics, touching on their chronology and paleoenvironmental context, and then look at how this can be situated not only in the South Asian perspective, but how it relates to what was happening globally. So this is the region I'm going to touch on. Let me just see if this map, yes, it's zooming down. So it's in this part of southern India, not far from the city of Chennai, and in some very important river basins. And you can see all these little red dots here are prehistoric sites which we have surveyed and documented over the last 20 years. And this is really a long-term project with a growing list of collaborators and students, and we hope to add more in the coming years. So in the study region, we begin by looking at this landscape, and I have zoomed down here to this region of around 8,000 square kilometers, where we have chosen our to focus our research, ranging from the hills in this region over here to the Bay of Bengal, which lies over here. And it's a region marked by a diversity of geomorphological contexts in which you find these archaeological and these prehistoric sites. Again, this particular small region has had a fabulous history of research starting way back in the 19th century with Robert Bruce Foote, who discovered the first Paleolithic tool at some of the sites where we are currently working. And it's very interesting to see that at the time of his discovery in 1863, he was well aware with what was happening in Britain and France with discoveries by Boucher-Lippert, by the work of John Evans and others. And so when he came across this tool, he said it was a matter of pure satisfaction rather than great surprise, because he was possibly in his mind expecting to find something here, identified it as a tool, thereby pushing back the antiquity of human occupation in this region. And then he went on to publish extensively his work and was the first to really put Indian prehistory or the Paleolithic in in front of the world through his publications, through attending conferences, displays of tools, and so on and so forth. Including the fact that possibly the first description of the cleaver was made in his paper in 1863. And starting from then on, in the 1930s, again, a number of people came back to work in this region. I can't go into all the details now, but we published a little paper on that, and I'll pitch for the paper over here. And it's very interesting to see that concepts being developed in Europe, for example, here by Oswald Mengin, and the terms coined by him, such as the Madrasian, representing the Acheulian assemblage of southern India, were picked up in India, and then it were later taken forward by Indian prehistorians who worked in this region and tried to situate the lithic assemblages in relation to river terrace sequences and build some sort of a cultural and chronological framework in the 1930s. And then later on, the region was studied again in the 1960s with excavations by the Archaeological Survey of India, and I'll come back to them a little later and the importance of their work. So you can see that even in this small region, there have been a diversity of approaches towards the prehistoric record even before we began our research project. Now, our project started in the 1990s onwards, 1999 onwards, and even earlier, a little bit earlier than that. And what we did was firstly, very systematic surveys and sampling of this vast region using a combination of satellite remote sensing and different types of sampling, field survey and sampling strategies. And not only transects, but grids being laid out, test pits, and even we have started using nowadays ground penetrating radar to identify sediments of interest for us. And because of the fact that many of these sites are threatened by infrastructure development and so on, we also worked on and published papers related to predictive location modeling, so that we could locate sites very fast with our very limited funds and very limited time, and then go back to the regions which predict the location of, say, Acheulian sites, test our hypothesis, and then sort of recover and, if possible, salvage or survey sites before they are gone forever. So this worked pretty well, and this is also published, and you can refer to that. So these surveys are still continuing, and we are still adding to the database of sites that we have in terms of not only the lithics, but also recording other aspects of the stratigraphy sediments for paleoenvironmental studies. So as a result of this, we located a large number of Acheulian sites, many of which had been already discovered by previous workers like Bruce Foote or V.D. Krishnaswamy over the years, but we could visit them again and provide new perspectives on what we felt were the stratigraphic context or the nature of the assemblage. So right up to the late Paleolithic. And this led to the creation of these wonderful databases, which we are now working on, and more students are also going to be involved in studying these. So we see that in this geomorphological and geological map over here, you see that sites occur in many different sedimentary contexts, whether it is in fluvial lacustrine like here, or whether it's in regoliths, or whether it is in some types of ferricretes and ferruginous sediments, rock shelters, whatever it is. We see that sites occur in different sedimentary contexts and with particular spatial patterning as regards their distribution. So, for example, we note that most of the Acheulian sites are clustered in this part of the study region, whereas once you come to the Middle Paleolithic, you get them all over, and for the Late Paleolithic, they're really everywhere. So this is not merely a behavioral, of significance related to the location of, say, raw material, but it's also related to the preservation of early Pleistocene and Middle Pleistocene sediments, which are differentially preserved across the region. So it's a combination of many factors: sediment exposures, raw material occurrence, and behavior. Similarly, when we study the sources of raw materials through time, and we have done that, in all these little colors here on the map represent different geological formations from where you get quartzitic sandstones, chert, even silicified wood. So this raw material, once we mapped them, we not only looked at what they were, but we also looked at the nature of occurrence. For example, here we see that some in the form of cobble, some are slabs, some are whatever they may be. And this leads to very interesting observations on differences in rocks exploited by, say, Acheulian hominins versus those exploited by the Middle Paleolithic, and so on, because of issues related to the distribution of these gravel beds, their availability at certain points of time, or their burial at other points in time. So this is a very interesting aspect of this region, which we can tie very well into changing decision-making strategies through time. Similarly, we see variability in site sizes, in artifact densities, and in the composition of assemblages across the region. So this represents the Acheulian. So you have some areas, for example, where you have these giant codes and manufacturing sites, and others like Attirampakkam, where you have only the final products, the final hand axes and cleavers, and we lack this. So this gives us a lot of insights, not only into functional variability, but also forces us to tackle very complex issues of palimpsests on stable land surfaces and formation processes, of course. And in addition to looking at the sites, there is this wonderful quaternary data of areas which may not have any prehistoric site, but may lie adjacent to them or somewhere else, from which you can start getting dates for, and you can start building up the evolution of the Pleistocene and early Holocene landscapes in this region. So from there, we can zoom down to some tinier micro regions. Say, like this tiny example given here, 10 by 10 kilometers around the site of Attirampakkam, which I'll come to now, in which very local changes in this, in the fluvial dynamics can be identified as we move up this little gully, this little stream over here from the hills and down to the site, and then where it joins the river today. In addition to this, along with our colleagues from India and from Sri Lanka, we have been trying to build up some record of paleoenvironments in this region. It's really difficult because we don't have fossil fauna to that extent, but we did get a very good record of phytoliths and other studies in mineral magnetics and geochemistry, which helped us build up some idea not only of the vegetation, but also of fluctuating phases of greater and less aridity, some more humidity in certain phases, local changes in the environment at and around Attirampakkam. And in addition to looking at the paleoenvironmental or phytolith data from the site, my colleagues have also done this wonderful study on taphonomy. in which they were able to look at modern and more recent phytoliths and plant productivity and build models to look at how this varied in the past. So it's all published and you can have a look at those papers as well. Now, when we zoom down even further, we are coming from this broad region here to this core zone with all the little yellow dots representing Paleolithic sites, and then zooming down to where we have focused, that is Attirampakkam. So this is an issue at the site at Attirampakkam. You can see here it's a very big area of 50,000 square meters and very heavily contoured. And as you walk across it through the years, you walk across a carpet of tools. Now, one of the important aspects here is that people have been randomly collecting these artifacts over the past 100 years. And because of this contoured surface, many of these artifacts come from different time periods, and artifacts which come around the site may even come from somewhere else. So the database, the data which has been largely hand accessed, people generally tend to pick up only the good looking tools, and that is the bifaces. This data is very biased. But this is what you find collected in many museums and universities and departments. So when we started our work, we realized this and therefore went for very, very extensive excavations at this site. This site also gives you a good idea to test theories of surface and subsurface variability and looking at the very concept of what is a site itself. This area is what we see artifacts eroding out, and so we call it a site. But we were interested in seeing what's happening here, which are all very, very deeply buried. So we did a GPR survey, and you can see them moving this across the site to look at whether the archaeological artifact-bearing deposits exist elsewhere. To what extent do they exist? What do we see in the patterning there at the subsurface level? And gain a wider understanding. At the site itself, we took a number of trenches across the area to get a better perspective on what was happening. And we also excavated in neighbouring sites, which I'll come to a little later. So in addition to horizontal step trenches and very large sample sizes, we also sieved everything, including every bit of sediment, to get this sort of micro debitage you can see in our hand here, really important for site formation studies. And at other sites, we have begun to employ a lot of 3D photogrammetry and mapping using laser total stations to get more precision. So what do we see here? Now, if you look at Attirampakkam, through time, there have been different interpretations on the stratigraphy and culture sequence. You may think that's puzzling, but this is exactly what we see at many sites in India. So, for example, in the 19th century, if this was considered to be the Acheulian context, this little gravel bed here, and in the 1930s as well, when the first excavation started in the 1960s, a completely different picture emerged, and the Acheulian was thought to be underlying this gravel bed, and this bed was something called a post-Acheulian. And when we excavated, we found in every layer something, right from the Acheulian, which was deeply buried, to a middle and transitional and middle Paleolithic emerging here, a typical middle, and then at a certain point, the site was abandoned. So this is the stratigraphic sequence at this particular site. So it was obviously attracting hominins for a very long time period with some sort of a break occurring at this point in time. The Acheulian levels occur in these very, very thick, deeply buried sediments, and you can see everywhere, right from top to bottom, we got artifacts, including some conjoinable pieces. This is an eclat ciré, which is conjoinable, and provided a fantastic opportunity to look at this long-term sequence, what is happening in the early Pleistocene Acheulian at this site. So this was a very rare chance, and we were very happy to get this data. When we dated it, we used paleomag and cosmogenic burial measurements on some of the artifacts, which gave us age ranges from around 1.07 to 1.7 and a mean around 1.5. This was very exciting for us. It was at that point in time the oldest in India, but not unexpected, because previous studies had suggested and hinted at a great antiquity for the Acheulian, and we could just, I think, just confirm it. And more dates are indeed going to come up supporting this. But it was interesting because it was important not only to look at the age estimates for migration out of Africa, which had been proposed, the timing and nature, but also to compare artifacts between Africa and India, possibly having within the similar time ranges. But more than that, in my view, this is really great, but it's also important for looking at evolutionary trajectories within the Indian Acheulian. What is happening over this huge time period, and local adaptation. So it had multiple areas of significance. When we look at the Acheulian assemblage itself, you have your typical large flake Acheulian, but we noted spatial and temporal variability, not only down the trench, which we excavated, where you have differences in intensity of occupation, but also spatial variability in assemblage structure, in artifact dimensions, and in the composition of assemblages, indicative of some local functional differences, differences or ways in which they occupied this site through time and across it, because our trenches were scattered all over, so we could get a good idea on this. And what was really interesting is, in this earliest phase of occupation, there is no raw material at the site. So it's a very fine-grained fluvial, lacustrine deposit. There are no cobbles on boulders suitable for large flake production. So like in many Acheulian sites across the world, we see a fragmented reduction sequence here, from where most of the raw material was sourced from here or from this area, 5 to 10 kilometers, and possibly we noted at two areas some buried sources which could have been used, and some provenance studies are now going on with the raw material and with our artifacts. So I think that's coming up with some interesting results. So what was happening? Off-site, somewhere else in the landscape, which we have now identified, you have these sites with these large cores and large flake production through various methods, brought to the site, further shaped into hand axes, cleavers, a number of large cutting tools. And what is important is this generates a lot of waste products. These waste products were not merely discarded, but several were retouched into a very significant small flake tool component. So this behavioral structure at the site, including introduction of certain artifacts, removal of perhaps curation of hammerstones, and carrying away of some of the hand axes, which we estimated based on some comparisons with the amount of biface thinning flakes as compared to the amount of hand axes, and a small proportion of tools on cores, and very few on cobbles, and very few small cores. So to interpret this better, the key was experimental studies, which my colleague Dr. Kumar Akhilesh, who is I think here in the audience, is doing. So this project of his is to design experiments that can aid in interpreting Acheulian behavior at the site. And he is doing this through, large flake reduction, manufacture of different types of artifacts like these hand axes or cleavers, determining the sources, exploring raw material variability, and ending up with functional and microwear studies. So for this, he is at present creating a database of tool use on different raw materials, on different materials, so that ultimately we will be able to move one step forward in looking at the meaning of some of the lithic seen at the site. In our lithic studies, we are looking for patterning. For example, in the nature of large flakes brought to the site, like these wonderful Combeva technology, which we see here, patterning in metrical dimensions, deconstructing bifaces in greater detail. And right now, my colleague, Dr. Prachi Joshi, is moving on to geometric morphometrics of a huge collection of hand axes we have. Identifying strategies, say, for cleaver production, comparing experimental and archaeological data, and of course, a lot of attention paid to the waste flakes, which often everyone ignores in India, and the small flake tool component. So I'll talk a little bit about these now. Very simply, we have a diversity of large flakes at the site, and interestingly, falling within certain preferred size ranges when they were introduced here, and reflecting number of techniques for the detachment of these large flakes, whether it is Combeva, whether it is slicing cobble, other methods of bifacially flaking cores. We see the evidence on the large flakes despite the absence of the giant cores. We have a predominance of hand axes. We have both hand axes and cleavers, but unlike sites in parts of central and western India where cleavers predominate to a large extent, here we have a predominance of the hand axes, and they are primarily on large flake blanks with a paucity of tools on cobbles. And we have identified a number of technologies for hand axe façonnage. So this is being done with both geometric morphometrics as also diacritical studies of the lithics themselves, looking at generations of flaking, looking at areas which were preferred, so on and so forth. Cleavers are very few. Yet, despite that, there are definite size preferences and a number of 4 or 5 different technologies for manufacture of cleavers, which we have managed now to replicate experimentally. So we have, Acheulian has been able to replicate different techniques used for the manufacture of Acheulian cleavers at Attirampakkam, which gives us some insight into their approaches towards, conceiving of this tool within a large core and then using one or more strategies to be able to detach the cleaver flakes, which were then subjected to some amount of reduction, which was mostly minimal. So it is interesting to note that because of the raw material paucity on site, there is some degree of planning and anticipation. Not only do we see this in curation of hammerstone somewhere else, but in the use of bifaces as cores. And why do I say that? The biface thinning flakes or biface flakes arising from different stages of biface façonnage were not merely discarded, but in many cases were retouched into a number of small flake tools. So like this, we see many different strategies at this site, which tell us a lot about changing decision-making, changing approaches towards planning, anticipation, and goals within these early Acheulian populations. Very, very significant proportion of small flake tools we have now studied in detail and are looking at them in relation to the blanks which initially come from the waste product. So you have a lot of biface thinning flakes which were retouched as well as other flakes. And in the waste products, in addition to typical napping, traces of some napping issues like these C-ray breaks, we also get evidence of different issues related to levels of skill, whether it is the C-ray, whether it is the step terminations, which we could compare with our experimental sample, whether it's a broken apex or various problems arising in resolving napping errors on the hand axes themselves, and be able to put forward some ideas as to how these Acheulian hominids coped with these errors which occurred during napping or didn't. And in many cases, we see that they just didn't bother to resolve issues which we would think that would be necessary to resolve because they have achieved a very suitable cutting edge which they desire. What happens next? At Attirampakkam in particular, we have very interesting questions which can lead us into understanding the ending of the Acheulian and transitions to the Middle Paleolithic. So in the Indian context, most prehistorians have recognized through time a gradual transition from the Acheulian to the early middle, with a continuity of bifaces and appearance of other tool types and different technologies, including Levallois. So many others hold different views, in which they believed that presence or absence of hand axes were one way of being able to differentiate the middle from the Acheulian. In our own analysis, we believe that rather than looking at type fossils as a hand axe or the Levallois or any other technology or typology to be able to identify processes of change, we have preferred to take the entire assemblage structure into consideration and therefore put forward certain theories on what we feel was happening in this region. Broadly, within India as a whole, there have been many issues in defining what is considered to be a late Acheulian. So you have the early Acheulian or the early Pleistocene Acheulian in our case, which is fairly well identified and defined. But when you come to later phases, there have been a number of theories related to either hand axe refinement or frequency of hand axe cleavers, or issues related to resharpening concepts or changes in the composition of the assemblage, which have been debated. And this is still an issue because we have very few dates. So to be able to situate an Acheulian site very precisely relating, taking, for example, only refinement or only hand axe cleaver frequencies may not be very wise. Similarly, there are issues in defining the Indian Middle Paleolithic, whether it is stratigraphically defined, overlying the Acheulian, in terms of raw material shifts, in terms of biface presence and absence, in terms of the appearance of diminutive bifaces, or the presence of Levallois and blades and points. So I won't go into all these debates right now. Many of them are clearly wrong and were made at certain points in time where certain concepts prevailed. But it is something worth considering when we examine our own site. It is very clear that no one parameter can be used to be able to make a conclusive definition of any cultural phase in the Indian context. And on top of that, we need to factor in site formation issues, issues of preservation, and other factors before we make some grand statements about what is happening and at the ending and beginning of some cultural phase. So there is also a great deal of variability. We know, for example, that from previous work in the Indian Middle Paleolithic, there are reports of hand axes at many sites across the country, which continue in time, some being rather large and others being more diminutive in size. Similarly, there is a lot of literature which has been published on the Levallois component at these sites and on the presence of points and their variability or proportions in an assemblage across the country. When you zoom down now to Attirampakkam, what we see is a gradual disappearance of the typical Acheulian large flake technology, which so characterizes the previous assemblages. And there is a shift towards small flake production using different strategies such as Levallois, the appearance of laminar elements, and altogether suggesting a gradual adoption of a new behavioral package. When we dated this, and we published this in 2018, we identified at least 3 cultural phases. And in the first phase, which we termed phase 1, you have still a continuity of the Acheulian element of the few bifaces, which become gradually more diminutive, appearance of tools with possible potential tanks, and a gradual shift where these elements fall off and you have a more typical Middle Paleolithic with Levallois, with these pointed tools and with a different assemblage composition that has no more any connection with the preceding Acheulian. So we had 3 phases, the last phase of which at around 74,000, you do not see the layer is more or less archaeologically sterile and the site was abandoned. So from around 380 plus minus 64, don't forget the plus minus, to around 172,000, we see these changes occurring. When we published this, obviously this created a bit of a furor because it was something very different to the hypothesis that had been proposed earlier, suggesting a much later origin for the Middle Paleolithic in India. However, we stood by our data, and more recently, more dates have come out from neighboring regions in Southeast India, which tend to support that something different was happening here. And I won't go into all the details, but suffice to say that when we are talking about transitions and technological change and drawing little arrows across the world, many of these arrows may probably be quite wrong because it's something that cannot be simplified. And it is better to understand the nuances and the complexity of the processes and data, and to acknowledge that there are many things that we do not as yet know, rather than put forward theories which perhaps really have no relevance when considering the Indian archaeological record. Lastly, we have zoomed down from the region to one site, to the site of Attirampakkam. And we saw that at Attirampakkam, although we have an early Acheulian and we have evidence of a later transition to the middle, there are certain records which have a chronological, sedimentological, and cultural gap. To be able to figure this out and to be able to understand what's happening in this region with all these little sites, we recently took up another excavation in collaboration with colleagues at CNIA at a neighboring site. I'll just reduce it to Sen, but it's called Senra and Palyam. So at Attirampakkam, while we have these two phases of an early Acheulian and an early middle, we lack a late Acheulian here completely, and we really don't know what was happening in the region at this time period. We hope that this site would answer these questions, and in our excavation, we did indeed, following a lot of surveys over many years, find this Acheulian assemblages with rich in hand axes, cleavers, and a typical Acheulian large flake, and potentially technologically looking younger than that as what we saw at Attirampakkam, although the dates are awaited. But what was equally interesting was that at this site, underlying the Acheulian, we found another Lower Paleolithic, completely unexpected assemblage, which lacked many of the Acheulian elements. So this is an example of the site, one of the layers here. And in the stratigraphy, this is where we find the Acheulian in this ferruginous gravel here. And then it goes down quite deep to around 3 meters, in which you have a ferricrete, in which lacking these large cobble clasts, in which you have another Lower Paleolithic assemblage. The site is beautifully preserved, and we are getting a lot of conjoinable tools from both these levels, which my colleagues are working on right now. So this is just an example of what it looks like. Lots of codes. So for the first time, we are finding in this region sites with very, very large giant codes, entire stages of manufacture of bifaces and many other tools, the waste products, the microdebitage, everything we are getting here. And underlying this very, very interesting assemblage, which comprises primarily small cores and flakes. So you have, you can see here a small flake, the scale is present for you here, and a scatter of these small cores and flakes across the trench. These are really tiny. So you can see here the size ranges of some of the small flakes, cores, waste products are really small over here in this map, and a few of them are retouched. We get also a wonderful collection of cores which Akhilesh and Prachi are now studying and deconstructing these cores, trying to understand very different ways in which they have been reduced, ranging from minimally reduced to some amount of flaking being done, but in general, a very simple core reduction strategies are noted at this site, new site. So now I really don't know how to interpret the site right now. We are waiting for the dates, which we are getting done, and we'll then put the the entire picture into some good chronological framework. But at present, we do not know whether it is a variant of the Acheulian in terms of function, lacking bifaces, LCTs, biface reduction debitage, or whether we have some other alternate hypothesis that can be proposed for this site. So that's just, I hope I can speak more on that later this year. Lastly, I'll conclude by moving from research to outreach, in which we have a very strong component of public outreach activities, primarily because many of these sites are being destroyed by rapid urbanization. So for this, we did a study of impacts at many of these archaeological sites and try to quantify the damage which is occurring and propose some plans for individual site conservation. And of course, continuous approaches to public outreach with children, with teachers, with a diversity of audiences to be able to expose them to Indian prehistory through innovative pedagogy, interdisciplinary and immersive learning, specific targeted ideas in workshops, and sensitizing people towards the issues related to the conservation of prehistoric sites. So with that, I conclude. Thank you all very much for listening in. And I would like to thank all the colleagues you see on this screen here. It's a team of scientists from many different countries, from India and abroad, who are working on a very different topics, totally interdisciplinary and holistic. And we are constantly adding colleagues to this team. They have been joining us for the past 20 years. Volunteers are being added, students are being added. The local community has played a very key role in helping us in our work. And of course, the funding agencies and the authorities who have granted us permits and given us the opportunity to do this study. So thank you for listening very patiently, and I'd be happy to take questions.
Wow, thank you very much. That was very good. I think at the very least, despite the amazing information you presented, that's probably one of the most visually pleasing PowerPoints I've ever seen in my life. I think I'm going to completely abuse my power as the host and ask the first question. But if anyone else has questions, please don't be afraid to stick your use the hand up function or stick it in the chat. For my question, I'd like to ask very specifically about the outreach that you do. Really quickly, without too much detail, what is the public opinion of the study of prehistory in India? I'd like to know how it sort of how well it maps onto our public opinion.
Okay, so firstly, in India, the awareness of prehistory is very low because we have such wonderful later heritage. So if you compare it with the monumental architecture, the sculptures and paintings, obviously less attention was paid to prehistory. But over the last 20 years, we started public outreach actually in 1999 with the Small Children's Museum. And through that, over these years, we have seen a fantastic response, not only at the village level, at the rural level, where we are speaking to people who are local stakeholders and their children, or whether we are speaking to an urban and very elite audience. It doesn't matter. The way in which you communicate prehistory has to be immersive. It has to bring alive stone tools to everybody. It's okay publishing in Nature and Science, but that doesn't mean anything when it doesn't reach the people who live on the land where the site is. So this is our aim. And it's been fantastic. There has been, even I think tomorrow morning, we are having a workshop for children, 6-year-olds. So this combination of research and communication, we felt right from the beginning of our work was essential. And I think it's been absolutely a fantastic experience. Every year, the number of children coming, the number of people who want to know increases. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Amazing. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions they would like to ask? Do you have any in the room that would like to ask? Did I? Yes, Thilanka. I'm sorry if I'm going to butcher some names, but Thilanka.
Thank you, Harry. Prof. Shanti, I have a quick question that maybe is not relevant to the time period covering in your presentation, but this may about the Middle Paleolithic and Microlithic transition in India, which recently published by Petrali and others, and also concerned by Melas. So can you say something about this
Yeah, it's
Middle
a very tough
Paleolithic to
question.
Microlithic transition?
It's not really my area of study, but there are, of course, two views. One is that there is something coming in from outside with microlithic populations of modern humans coming in with the microlithic technology, and therefore a sort of a break in the record where you have modern humans and associated with microliths, and then right down to Sri Lanka. Even we are working right now on microlithic sites in sediments which are similar to your Iranamadu formation, that is the theory. So I will be tackling this question maybe later this year when that project starts. But as regards Michael Petraglia and their team's view, I would tend to look at that. Yes, we do see in many sites an evolution of blade technology. Even I think Dr. Arun is here in the audience. He has presented recently on that in his area. We see it in our area. Others have written about it in the past. Now, as regards the association of Middle Paleolithic with modern humans, which is the key to all their debates, I really do not know. We don't have hominin fossils associated with Middle Paleolithic sites in India. It is anybody's guess as to who was making them, because relating tool types and technology to species has proved to be more and more problematic. While you can with some certainty relate microliths to modern humans, I'm not so sure about the past. So this remains a major debate, and until you find fossils or date more sites spanning this transition, this problem will remain. I hope it answers your question.
Yeah, thank you, Shanti. Thank you.
Thanks, that was a great question. Any other questions? Yes, John?
Hello, Shanti. Good
Hi.
to see you. And it's been a great talk. And for those of us who do Acheulian, of course, it makes us think of lots of things. And I thought you were so, when you said we should be careful about all the little arrows, I couldn't agree more. And I was just thinking even, we have Acheulian in East Africa at about 1.7 million. You have more than 1.5 million. How do we know which way the ideas are going? Do we even know it's coming from Africa to India?
I don't know. That's a fabulous question, and I really don't know the answer. Obviously, everyone likes to think it started with them. So, but I wouldn't go so far. It's only one site, and I know there are more, and there are a handful which were dated before we started our date work as well, and they were saying this before we did. So there are many views. I know Professor Sheila Mishra has a different view, and more sites with quite old dates are going to be published, I hope, shortly. But which direction things were moving, I really don't know. Obviously, right now, the burden of proof is on Africa. The oldest dates are Africa, so might as well stick with that for now. But the idea might change in the future.
Okay, well, good luck to you with it as well.
Yeah.
Great question. Yes, Dylan, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, I've had a question directed to me in the chat, but I don't think everyone can see it, so I'll read it out. The question is, with Pakistan being a substantial part of South Asia, what progress or potential on the west side of the Indus Valley is there from an archaeological perspective?
I think it's wonderful. The fantastic work is being done, we know, in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh for later time periods, and in Nepal also by Dr. Gudrun Corvinus. So the whole of South Asia is a paradise for prehistory, if I might put it that way. Does that answer his question?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, I'm sure they can let you know if there's anything else they want clarification on. But thank you.
Great. Are there any other questions? I am aware of time. If not, I think I'd like to say thanks to you, Shanti, for an excellent talk, and thank you for staying up so late. I know it must be about 7:30 or something where you are.
Yes, yes.
Yes, thank you for your time. It was really, really good, and hopefully we can have you back again. That was amazing.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and really happy to speak here. Thank you.
You're very, very welcome. Thanks,
Okay.
guys. And please come to our talk next week. I don't have the title at hand here, but I'm sure it's going to be very good.
Okay.
Thanks
Bye.
very much. See you later. Thank you.
Thank you.